Now in the last presentation, you have seen what we need to do to add that flightId parameter into our system. So move to app.module.ts and scroll a little bit down until you can find our path for book flight. So here at book flight, we need to define which flight you want to book by submitting an ID as a parameter. Let's go ahead and add it. As we said, you add a slash, you add a colon to indicate that the following part, which is now common, is a route parameter, flightId. This is the name of our identifier. This is one of the parts we have to do. Now we also need to do that, as we said, inside of the button. So go into search flights component.html, again to our A tag. You might already have that still open from one of the last videos. So just go here to add router link, what we just have added. And here we do exactly the same stuff, but we don't just add it here as a slash. We simply take that array, go into here and just add the parameter flight.id. So keep in mind that flight is this one here from inside of our loop. Now let's save it so far. Once we now click on /book flight, we will also submit the flight ID. So a good idea would be to go into our new component, book flight, and display that ID so that we can prove that it's working, right? So on the right side, close the search flights folder and open the book flight folder and go into the template HTML, right? So book flight component HTML. Now inside here, let's simply display as an H2, as a heading, the flight ID. Let's bind it to flightId. Now you might now think, okay, what's the flight ID? We haven't defined it because our book flight component doesn't know flight ID. That's fine. So now we have to know, and that's fine. So now we know what we have to do next. Copy that flight ID here. Let's save it and let's go into our book flight component.ts, because the template is rendering what we define here. And if we want to define a property called flight ID, we need to define a property right here with exactly that name. So let's do that. Flight ID is of type string and the default value is not loaded. Now, as I said, we take that flight ID from the route directly. We go into the second line and import activated route. And we import that from @angular/router. There we go. Now go inside of the constructor, because here we now take that activated route from the injection private route of type activated route. Now we can access the route or the URL we are currently visiting. So let's go ahead. This route.paramap to grab the parameters. And now we again, since this is an observable, we can subscribe to it. Subscribe, or let me just get that dot in the correct line. Subscribe to it, where the parameter goes to this.flightId equals to parameter.get flightId. And if this is null, then we provide not passed. Great. So what is that doing? We can also simply hold the cursor above some functions or methods here. You can see paramap is an observable. This is why we can subscribe to it, right? And a paramap that contains the map of the required and optional parameters of the specific route. So once we receive the information about it, so this is what subscribe is doing, we go through each parameter, and this flight is this one here. The value is if the parameter map contains the flight ID, and if so, then we take that value, and if we don't have that flight ID, we simply set the value of that string property to not passed, right? Good. Now let's save it. Let's start the application. Let's click on search, and now let's click on book. Take a look at the URL. You can see book minus flight slash, and you can see that GUID here. This is our flight ID. So it's attached to our URL. Let's call it route. And we now go into the component, access that route here, and simply grab the ID, the flight ID, and display it right here. This is what is happening. And now the component knows, okay, the user wants to book the flight which has this ID.